Welcome to Midweek, Experiments in Faithfulness. This is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice where we learn and grow with each other in community. My name is Brent, and I am the Program and Engagement Manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House. We are a Quaker Center for Learning. We are also home to Beacon Hill Friends Meeting, and we are a residential community of about 20 people. Tonight, Kat Green will be presenting ekphrastic poetry, poetry that reacts to a work of art. It's a way to see things in a new way. In this midweek, we'll read and discuss ekphrastic poems and then write some together based on our favorite pieces of art. We use this practice of poetry to deepen the spiritual experience of viewing art. Now I'm excited to introduce you to Kat Green, who is a Boston-based writer with a focus on history, memory, gender, and religion. Their debut chapbook, I Am Never Leaving Williamsburg, is forthcoming with Fifth Wheel Press in February of 2025. And you can find their work at cmgreenwrites.com. Kat, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you all tonight doing midweek. I used to work at the Friends House, and at that time I was doing what Brent's doing now. And so it's really great to be back here sharing a spiritual practice that I really love, that's important to me. We're going to talk about ekphrastic poetry tonight, and I'm going to share my screen so we can go through a little slideshow. All right. So we're going to talk about ekphrastic poetry this December 11th, 2024. We're going to start by talking about what it is, how it might be a spiritual practice, and then we will read some examples of ekphrastic poetry, and then we'll have the opportunity to write some of our own, and we'll kind of pause for discussion at different stages. All right. So what is ekphrastic poetry? This definition comes from the Poetry Foundation. I did not write it myself, but it shares that an ekphrastic poem is a vivid description of a scene, or more commonly a work of art. Through the imaginative act of narrating and reflecting on the action of a painting or sculpture, the poet may amplify and expand its meaning. So how is this a spiritual practice? Well, for some people, any kind of writing can be spiritual. For myself, that's certainly the case. But I think ekphrastic poetry is particularly notable as a spiritual practice. And so I want us to just take a minute to reflect on some of these questions. And then if folks want to share and come off mute, you can, but we're here in a Quaker space, so it's also fine if we just want to sit in some silence. First, let's think about what art stirs in you. And here I'm specifically talking about visual art, such as painting, sculpture, drawing. But think about for a moment, what does art stir in you, and what happens to you when you view a work of art? Just take a minute, ponder this question, and if you would like to come off mute and share, you certainly can.
I think for me, some of the art that resonates most with me stirs nostalgia. I think about, when I look at something that really speaks to me, it's often because it reminds me of a time in my life where I've, been in a similar setting.
Yeah. I think part of the power that art has in that sense is the connection across time and space, right? You view something in one setting that can call to mind a different setting, a different time, a different place in your life, in history, or anything like that. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I have a special affinity for installation art, which takes up a lot of space, and some are multimedia with sound. So when you come into a space, it's like immersive, and and bodily experience.
Mm.
So there's the visual element, but there's a lot of layers to sensory. So that's one of the ways I experience art.
I'm so glad you brought that up because it makes me think about art as an embodied experience, right? Something that engages all of who we are. It's not just intellectual. We feel it in our bodies. And especially, I think, maybe that's true, as you said, in installation art. Thank you.
When I look at art, I'm often aware, I'm drawn into the experience of making it.
Mm.
And, what was the experience of the artist as they were doing it? How was it embodying for them? And how does that work of art capture that experience? And then when it's some of my own work, I look back at it and I remember the experience of doing it, and I can sort of recreate it in a sense by looking at it again. And like right now I'm looking at a watercolor that's over my sink that a dear friend of mine made, and it's a stream that I love. It's a place I know. And so, I can like feel that and hear the water and the birds maybe, and just sort of, takes me into that space. So it's that experience.
Yeah. Thank you, Suzanne. I love that. And I think that connects what both Brent and May have said about how art connects us both to our bodies and to other times and spaces. Thank you.
I don't think about visual art super often in like such an in-depth way. So it's a really beautiful question to think about. And a memory that's coming to mind during this listening to you all is being at the Detroit Institute of Arts and seeing this painting, which I wish I could remember the artist or the name of it, but it was just there. It was like a watercolor, maybe some other kind of paint as well, kind of wintry scene that felt a little bit magical. And I just have this very sweet memory of like stopping in front of it and just pausing and feeling very calm. And I think it really made me like pay attention to it. Maybe the museum setting kind of forced me to do that in a sense where it was like I was trying to be more intentional about like really paying attention to what I was taking in visually. So I think there's something very like, I don't know, centering or grounding that can happen with intentionally paying attention to visual art.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that and used the phrase paying attention, because that's, to me, what ekphrastic poetry is all about. It's about paying very deep attention to a work of art. So I think that carries us really nicely to this next reflection question, which is about writing, right? So we're talking about ekphrastic poetry. It reacts to an image, to a piece of art, in writing. So not everyone's a writer, but I think all of us have written something in our lives, whether it's an email or a little note, grocery list. And some of us write poetry, some of us write stories. So the next question is, what does writing stir in you? What happens to you when you write something? And what I didn't include here, but I'll add, is if you aren't someone who writes often, you can also think, what happens when you read something? Yeah. So what does that written medium mean to you? And we'll just have the same, couple moments of silence. Anyone's welcome to come off mute and share, but no one's required to.
I love writing and I love telling stories. And for me, when I write, it opens new pathways of understanding for me. Many times, if I'm really having a hard time like grasping a concept, all I need to do is start writing about it or start trying to explain it to someone. And suddenly it's just like it opens this pathway to like, oh, yeah, that makes sense, you know. And so it's like it's sometimes something doesn't make sense until I say it myself. And um but even if I am like writing about memories from childhood or something like that, it can create new understanding about myself and how and why I show up in the world the way I do.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I got a new journal yesterday, and on the journal it said to write by hand is to think on paper, which I really liked, even though it's just, a piece of marketing for the journal. But I totally resonate with that. It's a way to understand the world around you, the world within you. Yeah, thanks so much.
So I'm not a writer, I'm a reader. And when I read something that really somehow it really touches me, whether it's poetry or prose, it's taking me deeper into that experience or that understanding. And I just marvel at people who can conjure up with words, that in a way that just makes me see or hear or feel something differently. And I did start a practice during pandemic, where I was living. We started in my co-housing community a sort of haiku, COVID haikus. And so I started writing haiku, and because I hadn't really written poetry before, but I found that just the simple structure of a haiku was something I could deal with, and and I still do it. And I have a whole bunch of haikus, some of which I think are good, and some of which I have no idea. But it doesn't, so I'm trying to let go of that, of whether it matters or not. So that's been a fun experience. My daughter is a poet and a translator of Spanish to English poetry. And so through her, I have a deeper understanding of poetry. I've always loved poetry, but and the sort of the miracle of translating from one language to another, and listening and listening to her talk about it, or reading her, she writes about it. I mean, that's how I knew about this word, because one of the poets she translates does a lot of ekphrastic poetry. I had no idea what that was until maybe a year ago.
Yeah, I really like how something that you're calling to mind, Susanna, is that writing and reading are relational, and um, you know, in many cases when we write, we are writing for an audience, even if the audience is like our future selves. That's still writing for a person that you don't know yet, because you don't know who you're going to be. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, that relational aspect, which again is also can be very spiritual for some people. Thank you.
I love how you said that writing and reading are relational, because I often feel as though when I'm reading, I get more inspiration. Like if I'm reading another poet, then I read a line and I just feel something in me that's like, I need to go write my own poems. And I think that it's, yeah, just a really beautiful way of seeing how, like, reading and taking other people's work, like with ekphrastic work, it that inspiration that comes from being in conversation with other creators is just like really powerful. Um, but with your original prompt question, I just had this memory of this Tumblr post that Ethel Kane had made a while ago that I saw and was just like, oh, this is how I feel about writing, where she said, if I don't make music, I feel as though I may burst, or something like that. And yeah, I think writing is like what tethers me to existence, like what grounds and settles me in a lot of ways and helps me make sense of the world. And yeah, it's just sweet to be asked to reflect on that and to recognize how significant it is.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that it points to this idea that we all crave expression of some kind. We all have something inside us that we want to share. Again, maybe just with your future self, maybe just with your current self, but yeah, there's something that we have within us that craves expression. Thank you. So given all of these things we're talking about, the ways that art connects us to our body, to other times and places, to ourselves, and the ways that writing can be an expression of that, the ways that reading and writing can be relational, I think that is really at the core of how ekphrastic poetry can be spiritual, because to me, part of my spiritual experience, I'll speak from involves paying deep attention. And that's something we've already talked about tonight as well, right? Is paying deep attention to the things around you. And what ekphrastic poetry invites us to do is to pay very deep attention to a work of art, pay attention to our own reactions to it, and create something out of that. I think creation is very spiritual as well. And so this kind of combination of these practices creates a new spiritual experience, which allows us to see the art and sometimes the world with new eyes and in new ways. So thank you all for that awesome discussion. I think we're going to move into reading some poems and discussing how they feel before we get into writing our own poems. So first, we're going to talk about a poem called Subject and Object, which is by MIDWEEK. And it's after this photograph, which is called Sueño number 5, Botella del Mar, I guess Número 5, I should say, which is a photograph by Greta Stern. And we're going to read the poem that MIDWEEK wrote after this photograph. Would anyone like to volunteer to read? It's a long poem, but maybe the first half of it. And if no one wants to read it, I'm happy to, but would love to have a volunteer.
I wouldn't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
So just through the warmed strand part?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. The woman sits clutching her knees inside a short-necked bottle on a beach, looks up smiling at a mouth above all imagined itineraries. We like to think she volunteered to be lowered into the bottle, on her own idea, even her own craftiness, lured into being enrobed with the thick glass that is the gray-blue of a ukiyo-e sky of flying cranes who breathe the steam of that bluish-gray ideation and end of autumn, or a plume of smoke from a train in the middle distance. Swells of warm seawater push wet sand against spun tips of seashells that sit on the warmed strand.
Would anyone like to read the next half? Thank you, Andrea.
Sure, I'll do that. I'm going to read this last sentence again because it continues. Swells of warm seawater push wet sand against spun tips of seashells that sit on the warm strand like nobility on a plush settee. The bottle's bottom edge lists in the hot sand. The heat of the morning sunlight penetrates the bottle walls, and foam and breeze coax a juddering creature from underneath. From inside, the woman argues with herself that the horizon is another of the world's ambitions. Those ships slipped into bottles with volition and self-responsibility acquiesce so marvelously, like the glass fitting so smoothly around her. She is a person born to be put into this and admired as perfection from the outside, which is how we love flowers and dreams, though our desires may suffocate them.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm going to take us back to the photograph now that we've read this poem. So we can just take another look at this. Just kind of reflect on this photograph. And then I'd just love to hear if anyone has any thoughts that strike them about this poem. I wanted to bring this poem to us as an example of ekphrasis that kind of is a little more traditional in describing the image, and at the same time expands on the meaning of the image, right? So there are things in this poem that are not directly in the photograph, right? It's the poet's imagination. What I like in this poem is that it places that photograph in the context of the world we live in outside of a photograph, right? I think this final couple of lines I really love. She is a person born to be put into this and admired as perfection from the outside, which is how we love flowers and dreams, though our desires may suffocate them. And to me, this is really kind of pointing to what it means to be an object, right? The title of the poem is Subject and Object. And we're thinking about this object of the photograph. Does she get to be a subject in her own life? Is she merely an object in the photograph? And what does it do to someone to be observed in that way? And so those are some of the things that this poem makes me think about. And if anyone else has anything they want to share, I'll leave another moment. But if not, we can also move on to the next poem.
This is so interesting because the photograph is really kind of surrealism,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so the poem just it describes what we're seeing, but it goes beyond that into trying to understand like what's happening in the photograph and imagining that she volunteered to go into this bottle, that it was her own idea, you know. And then the experience of being inside the bottle where it's like it's sitting on the hot sand and the heat of the morning is penetrating the bottle so that you could imagine like what's going on inside, you know, what does it feel like to be in the bottle. So this poem does more than just like describe. It's, you know, it's imagining being the person in the bottle,
Yeah,
you know, in some ways, which I think was really interesting.
totally.
Yeah.
Thanks, Suzanne.
When you said that, like, it's a very traditional ekphrastic piece, that struck me as really interesting because even before we were done reading it, I was like, this is a very, like, literal sort of ekphrastic piece. I'm used to reading or writing pieces that are much more like, or I guess much less directly referential to the art. And so I liked how it was more literal in a sense because it felt like kind of turning this person into a character, which, yeah, it's just really brought a lot more depth to how I saw the picture.
Yeah. And thank you for saying the word literal. I think that's probably what I meant more than traditional.
Oh, funny. Well, I'm glad.
Yes, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, exactly. And we are gonna get to read a poem that is a little different next. So excited for that as well. But I'm just gonna make another couple breaths of space if anyone else wants to share anything. Right, great. We're gonna read another poem. This is called Enchanted Beach with Three Fluid Graces, which is the name of this painting as well, which is a Salvador Dali painting. The poem is by Abdul Karim, who's a Nigerian poet. And yeah, I've got this one's a little shorter, so I have the painting on the next page as well, which I think will be interesting to look at them side by side. And again, if anybody would like to volunteer to read this, please feel free. I also am happy to. I do want to apologize for the little marks here where it says in the beginning. That's just the Google Slides format that I couldn't figure out. So you can ignore that. But yeah, and if anyone would like to come off mute and read this, please feel free. And if not, I'm happy to.
I can give it a try. I'm not used to reading poetry cold like that, though, so.
Yeah, go for it.
See. All things begin from the spindle. We say, life spun from graces. I grew like rain from rumbles of my parents' cloud, a dark dawn, admitting growth. In the beginning, I squeeze into existence with a head, white silhouette-like, formed from the stomach of the hard earth on a farther landscape. Face formed in a whole, a body merging into visibility. The last war of my body was unscathed, admitting the shapes of various dances. The second grace, where I am a boy seeking existential relevance, my visage. Like a landscape with an equestrian man with the body of dust pursuing the horse of his identity, relevance sinking. The thread of my life stretched to the doorsill of disappearance, the length of my language nearing a silence. I am the last body rhyming with the earth, becoming more illusion than truth. Holding on to the edge of my thread, bowing to the ache of an empty body, my fingers grip the edge of my cloth. That's all I can see.
I'm sorry. The last line is nature becomes a skull. I think, sorry that you can't see it. It's probably something I'm doing on Zoom. Thank you so much for reading. And I just want to say all three of you reading did a really excellent job. So I appreciate that. Yeah, and I again have on this one the painting right next to the poem. So that might be kind of an interesting experience to look at both together. And I'd love to hear any thoughts folks have about this poem as well, what it brings up for you, anything you notice. How is it different from the other poem? Anything you'd like to share. And we can have a beat of silence and speak out of that if anyone is so led.
I'm not sure if I'm missing something in the painting, but my interpretation of the poem and of the painting is that like the I in the poem is this figure that is like half formed on the far left side, like with no face. And that just feels really fascinating that that is the voice that the poet chose to take on. And also just it feels like this poem stands on its own in a really interesting way that's different from the like I can't remember the name of it, but the one that we just read. And I think maybe that is because it is more abstract and less like directly referential to the art, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I also am struck by the I in this poem, the speaker, which I also, I'm not 100% on, but I kind of interpreted the speaker as being all three of the figures in this painting, at different times potentially or in a different way, which I think is, yeah, to me, like changes how I look at the painting, which I think is part of the power of ekphrastic poetry, is that it can change how you perceive a work of art, depending on how you read the poem. So I think that's really cool also that we had different interpretations of who that I might be.
For sure.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this poem, painting, or how they interact?
Well, I'm with you, Kat, that I think the I, it's all, of the I is all three figures in different stages. But again, it still describes the painting, which is so interesting. A body merging into visibility, face formed in a hole. So there are very literal descriptions of what you can see. but then, you know, where I'm a boy seeking existential relevance, that's drawing something out of the painting that's more than just what's visually there.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Susanna, I agree. I think, like you said, it is describing the painting in a kind of a different way from how our last poem described the photograph, and reinterpreting it in a really cool way.
The line "nature becomes a skull" is you know, because if you look at each one of these figures, you know, none of them have a really formed face or head. And the one on the left, it's like it looks like a rock in the distance that's in the same place where the head would be, the skull.
Yeah. Yeah.
The word choice is just so powerful too, even just kind of separate from the ekphrasis aspect, just like the doorsill of disappearance, the last body rhyming with the earth. Like there's so many really beautiful, unique lines that I just really appreciate. I'm gonna want to jot down the name of the poem to come back to sometime.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, the thread of my life stretched to the doorsill of disappearance, the length of my language nearing a silence. I am the last body rhyming with the earth, becoming more illusion than truth. I mean, this is so beautiful, and it's such a beautiful description of this, you know, these figures.
Right. Yeah.
Because there is a lot of truth in there, you know, it's like.
Yeah. Any last thoughts on this poem before we move on to writing our own poems? Awesome. So on the next slide, I have included my favorite painting. And I'm going to write a poem after that painting. And I encourage you to see that as an invitation that if you would like to write your ekphrastic poem after that painting, you can. But I also want to encourage you, if there's another work of art that you love or that confounds you or that inspires you, whether it's something you can pull up easily on your phone. I know, May, you'd mentioned installation art. If there's an installation that you remember that might be interesting to write after. We're going to take about, it's 8:09, so we're going to take about 7 minutes, which isn't quite that long to write a poem, but we're going to take about 7 or 8 minutes to write after either the painting on the next slide, if it inspires you, or literally any other painting that you want to write after. And I would encourage you to, if you are having trouble knowing where to start with description, describing what you see in the painting, and then you can use the connections that emerge out of that. You know, we talked about art leading you to different times and places, art landing you in your body. So anything that emerges from that, I would encourage you to write. And so, yeah, this is The Demon Seated by Mikhail Vrubel. It is one of my favorite paintings, and it's huge in person, which is really cool. And I'm going to leave it up so that if you'd like to write after this painting, you certainly can. But once again, encourage you to write after any piece of art that you know, love, have seen, maybe hate. Maybe that's an interesting approach. A piece of art that, you know, makes you angry, and see what happens. Just take the next 7 or 8 minutes to write, stretch your imagination a little bit, pay very close attention to whatever it is you're writing about. And then we'll come back together and we can read together and share what the experience is like.